Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today, and a very happy Black History Month to everyone. My name is Taz Elias, and I'm part of the brand studio team in the communications department at the Wikimedia Foundation. In today's panel discussion, we'll be hearing from our three esteemed panelists about their work, their thoughts, and also the actions we can take to advance knowledge equity. For those unaware of what knowledge equity means in the context with which we'll be discussing today, according to Wikipedia, knowledge equity is a social science concept about expanding what is valued as knowledge and including those communities that may have been excluded from this discourse through imbalanced structures of power and privilege. This is a key element in the Wikimedia Foundation's mission to ensure that everyone, everywhere, has equitable access to create and consume knowledge. With that being said, let's get started with some introductions from our panelists. We'll start with Kelly. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Taz. So my name is Kelly Foster. I generally tend to describe myself as a public historian, which covers a lot of bases. But what that means practically is that I work particularly with independent archives. I'm currently the UK coordinator for a project called Whose Digital Archives, being run by Whose Knowledge, which is a global campaign to draw attention to and also bring to the forefront knowledge online from people who have been historically and currently disenfranchised from knowledge production. In addition to that, I work as a tour guide specialising in Black histories in London, women's histories in London, working class histories in London. And then on top of all of those things, I also edit Wikipedia as well. So I'm a rather infrequent, unfortunately, editor of Wikipedia. I'm also a trustee of Wikimedia UK, which is a charity that supports people to contribute to Wikipedia in the UK.
Amazing. Thank you very much for your contributions. Over to Jessica. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the invite. My name is Jessica de Abreu. I was born and bred in Amsterdam, where I'm now. I'm also co-founder of the Black Archives in Amsterdam, which is a historical archive that focuses on Black history, culture, literature, and most importantly, to focus from the perspective of Black Dutch people and communities. So often when people talk about, Black history, talk about slavery and colonialism, but I think the thing that we wanted to add from the Black Archives is to let the world know that there was always resistance, even during colonialism, slavery, that colonialism is not something that just happened to us, but we have always resisted. And that's what we are. We also are an archive out of resistance and an archive of resistance. So we document, obviously, also a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement, but also the Black movement that go out through Europe. But most importantly, to understand that, the debate around discrimination and racism is not something new, but actually has been here for decades, but also on this continent, Europe, like there has been decades of Black people who experience racism, exclusion, discrimination, but they have always resisted. So our archive is full of, documents, but also like film material of resistance movement of Black Dutch people and how resistance of Black people was always transnational. So it also has a lot of international focus. So yeah, thank you.
Amazing, thank you, Jessica. And over to you, Professor Adi.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the invitation. I'm Hakim Adi. I'm currently Professor of the History of Africa and the African Diaspora at the University of Chichester in West Sussex, Britain. What else am I? I'm consultant historian to the Young Historians Project, which is a project for young people between the ages roughly of 16 to 25 of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain who are developing history projects, history exhibitions to enlighten themselves and their peers, mainly about the history of African and Caribbean people in Britain. I'm one of the founders of the History Matters initiative, which was established in 2014 to look at why there were so few young people of African and Caribbean heritage engaging with history, particularly at academic level in schools, universities, and so on. I'm a former founder, member of Black and Asian Studies Association. I don't know, a few other things I can't remember. Anyway, that's me.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Hakim. We'll start with the first question. From your particular cultural context, could you let me know what does Black History Month mean to you? And I'll ask that to Kelly.
I was hoping you would start with somebody else. So I think, so October is Black History Month in the UK and also in the Netherlands. And of course is kind of the main initiative as to why we're all gathered here to speak about it. And whenever I think about Black History Month in the UK context, at least, I always am struck by how it's kind of taken for granted, to be honest. You know, Black History Month has been made over the past 40 or so years. It's been made and produced by teachers and librarians and parents and schools. It was started in 1987 as a result of the initiative, particularly of a man called Hakim Adi. And it was the culmination of a year's worth of activities that was known as the African Jubilee Year. And part of the reason that was happening in 1987 is because it was a centenary of the birth of a significant leader of the African diaspora called Marcus Garvey. So Black History Month in October came at the culmination of that year's worth of events. And I'm always reflective in October on how purposeful the founders of Black History Month were in planning the time of year that it would take place, how purposeful they were in kind of finding collaborators to work with at ILIA, which was the Inner London Education Authority, which was one of the bodies that took forward Black History Month. But over the past couple of years, especially since 2020, I've been also been reflecting on the needs for or the reminders that Black History Month, yes, takes place in October, but there is a need for us constantly to be understanding and researching and sharing knowledge about the history of people of African origin through the other 11 months of the year. Everything doesn't necessarily have to happen in October. Yeah, so that's where my mind goes to every October.
Here, wholeheartedly agree. Thank you very much. Jessica, what, from your cultural context, what does Black History Month mean to you? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so Black History Month is in the Netherlands, when it comes to organizing, quite a new concept. So we know about the Black History Month, definitely inspired by the US and the UK. We have also implemented it in October, indeed. Thank you, Kelly. And we call it our Black Achievement Month. And what it actually means to us is to, about our culture, our identity, our history, but particularly about the Black Dutch context. So especially, I think I can speak for Black communities on mainland Europe. We often know a lot about the conversation about race, history, Black history in particular. We know much about, for instance, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Angela Davis. We know there's a huge debate and youth resistance in the UK but understanding what Black history means to us, who are our own Black heroes on mainland Europe, that has been quite of a road. So that is what it means to us, is to understand that how we are also part of a broader tradition of Black history, and what can we add to the diversity of what it means to be Black in the world, but also within Europe. So that is the time where we stand still and reaffirm also our realities about what it means to be Black in the Netherlands. Because in contrast to the UK and the US, there has been a long history and tradition about talking about race, while in the Netherlands it's quite new. So that is the moment where we stand by, like, yes, we are here. We try to see ourselves, and we are very proud of ourselves, despite the different things that are happening, like exclusion, discrimination, and racism. But this is a moment where we celebrate ourselves and see how beautiful we are and how far we have come.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And Hakim, what does Black History Month mean to you?
It means to me that we're recognizing a problem, and so I struggle to see it as a celebratory event. It's essentially the recognition that for the other 11 months of the year, this important history, which is, as we're hearing, the history of Britain, the history of the Netherlands, the history of the world, but which is focused around people of African, you can say people of African and Caribbean heritage, Caribbean in the broadest sense of that term, is largely excluded, hidden, ignored the rest of the year. So we have this month to draw attention to that problem, and I think to find ways to solve it. And the danger is that October is, everything is crammed into October. There's this meeting and that meeting, this presentation, that presentation, and the rest of the year there's nothing. And it has the air of kind of tokenism about it. And I think we have to be very careful about how we utilize it and how we deal with it. I'm pleased to hear that in the Netherlands, rather like Britain, we have at least chosen the longest month of the year to, whereas in the US they chose the shortest month of the year, which seemed rather short-sighted approach to things. But as I say, I think it's a reflection of this problem, and we have to find ways to solve this problem and to make sure that this history is present, fully integrated in schools, universities, and media, and so on. Too often, even now, our young people, it was very evident in 2020 during the Black Lives Matter campaigns, that our young people were complaining that this history is not visible, they're not taught it in schools, they're made to feel they're invisible, everything is Eurocentric and so on, and that is the issue. So I think that's how I would look at it. I think the other thing that's become, I think, particularly noticeable perhaps this year, but we're living in a climate where history is generally under attack. All history is under attack by the powers that be. That's certainly the case in Britain, I think globally as well. There's a great effort being put into the falsification of history to continue to present a Eurocentric version of history, a history that excludes the vast majority of people, and we need to be conscious of that. I think for that reason, history, even this October, is under threat and under pressure, and it's noticeable, you could say, how little history is actually discussed during October. All sorts of other things are discussed, but history is often neglected. So there are a lot of problems to solve, and the struggle needs to continue to overcome those problems.
Thank you very much. With that in mind, I'd really like to know if and how the panel have seen the promise and the benefits of knowledge equity come to life in a historical context. Jessica, could you provide some examples, perhaps, of how you've seen knowledge equity in a historical context come to life in your experience?
Oh yeah, so from a very personal experience, the reason why I founded the Black Archives is because from a young age, we had no history about, you know, the history of slavery and colonialism, basically why my parents are connected to this country called the Netherlands and why they actually came here. So from a very young age, you felt already excluded, yeah, from the curriculum. And at a later age, I thought, okay, if I go to university, I would get to know more about, you know, Suriname, where my parents are from. Suriname is the largest colony of the Dutch Empire, or was the largest colony of the Dutch Empire. I would get to know a little bit more about my history. And then even then, it was just like Hakim Adi already said, and it's very Eurocentric. It was very much from a particular perspective that was very offensive, to be honest. So that is where my inspiration came from to actually work on, yeah, how can I empower myself and how can I do my own research, etc. But to come back to your question, it's like in the Netherlands, as I already mentioned, we are often seen as a very open country, tolerant, liberal, because we are one of the first, if not the first country who legalized same-sex marriage. We have legalized soft drugs. We have the red light district. So sexuality is not something that's always very much a taboo. They often ask this question, like, how can we be racist then, right? But at the same time, for Black people here, we very much experience it. So to come back to your question, what I wanted to say is that we have this movement where we now understand that, yeah, racism is a thing, despite that we are open, liberal, and tolerant in other different ways, but not in these terms. We talk now a little bit more about race, which is a whole lot in comparison with US and UK. We are very, very late. We are always seeing everything from a colorblind perspective. So within that movement, there is more talk about race, so the realities and where does it stems from, basically from the history of slavery, colonialism, its legacy, etc. How we can talk now a little bit, not just about racism, but institutionalized racism, institutional racism. So I'm very happy that there indeed is a Black History Month and we are in that sense more seen, but just as Hakim Adi said, it's not like, this is basically the bare minimum when it comes to our human rights and our civil rights. So for the Black Archives, I really want to contribute how we as Black people in the Netherlands and also Black people who visit us, how can we learn about our own history from our own perspective? So I'm very happy that a little bit more talk and more exposure about Black history. But what I'm very careful with at the Black Archives is that we stay owner of our own knowledge, especially in the context, colonial context, where we see that Black people were dehumanized and constructed in bodies who did not produce any knowledge or information. So it's very important for me at the Black Archives that, yes, we have all of this knowledge, right? History and slavery, but there was always resistance, but that we are also the owner of our own knowledge, that this is something that is from us that we can enjoy, and also how can we benefit from it at the same time, just like other communities benefit from their own knowledge and information. Yeah.
Amazing. Professor, I'd love to know how knowledge equity comes to life in your professional capacity, particularly.
Well, again, I think we probably need to start with the problem, as it were, which is that in general in society there isn't the equitable access to knowledge. Let's start with that. And not only isn't there access to it, but there's a continual struggle over the kind of falsification of knowledge and the attempt to create a situation where there's a lack of enlightenment, you could say, a lack of prevention of preventing people actually understanding the world in which they live. So that's like a deliberate act by the powers that be to attempt to deny people that outlook on the world, where people are able to understand the world, empower themselves, change the world in their own interests and so on. So I mean, that's the situation we're in. So then there's a need to find ways to combat that. And I suppose to give there, I mean, there are the numerous examples I could give. I suppose one is the Young Historians Project itself, which, as I mentioned earlier, grew out of this situation of the Eurocentric rendering of history, which has alienated many young Black people in this country, and finding ways to deal with that. So in regard to that, we organized a conference in 2015 called History Matters to analyze the problem, get people together who were affected by this problem of Eurocentrism and so on, and then to try and find some solutions. So one of the solutions that was posed or was presented at that conference was to provide something for young people to assist them in engaging with history. And that's how or why we created the Young Historians Project. And that is a project of young people, 16 to 25 years old, who decide what aspect of history they want to investigate and look at, and then investigate it and present it in ways that will be meaningful, enlightening, empowering for their peers. So that could be an exhibition, it could be a film, it could be an online exhibition, it could be a mural, it could be a whole variety of things. Again, they decide. And that has been helpful, I think, for many young people who've passed through our ranks in the last, 7 years or so. We've just finished, or they have just finished, a project looking at the history of African women in Britain, particularly African women in the health sector, and for example, have had a whole project developing murals in hospitals depicting African women and so on. So that's not just bringing enlightenment to those involved in the project, their peers, but also the wider public about history in general and the role of African women in particular. Also arising from that History Matters conference, there was a demand that what could we do with, how could we encourage older people who were put off history at school, but through their life and life experience have found that history is, they're really, really interested in history and they want to develop their skills as historians. So we set up a master's program for those people to encourage them to come back into education, to develop more skills, to engage in historical research. And we even encourage people like Kelly to take up that task, but many others. And so again, it's encouraging people to empower themselves, to engage with history, to become historians, to develop knowledge, to share knowledge, and so on. So those are just some examples, illustrations.
All incredible. Thank you very much for sharing. And over to Kelly. Kelly, you and I have worked on a particular knowledge equity project. So yeah, I'd love to know. You've probably very likely told me already, but I'd love for you to share.
Let me just mention that project for a minute, since you won't. So that was the Unseen project, where you were working with illustrators to provide openly licensed images of people who African or African origin people on Wikipedia, but for whom we do not have openly licensed images for, because the value and the benefit of actually seeing an image of someone who has a Wikipedia article, I think goes a great way into transmitting and kind of informing the general reading audience about that person. So that was earlier on this year, I think, for those of you who want to check out the Unseen Project. Some very interesting and varied people were included in that project, but also some really beautiful portraits were commissioned as well. For me, since we're talking about encyclopedias and knowledge equity, for me, it often goes back to what Jessica was mentioning about who was determined to be human, and in terms, and in turn, what did that mean for who was excluded from producing knowledge, or whose knowledge was then devalued, ignored, and hidden, obfuscated, as Hakim has described. My mind always turns to the 1911 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which had an article entitled Negro, which was about people racialized as Black today, African people racialized as Black. And that article in the Encyclopedia Britannica said that mentally the Negro is inferior to the white, and then goes on to talk about the deterioration of mental development in African and African descended people. There was a significant pushback, and that article, I should say, was written by a curator at the British Museum, a man called Thomas Athol Joyce. And that was the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica is seen as the pinnacle of encyclopediaism. The kind of the best edition, or the most thorough edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. One particularly strong voice that spoke out against that racist article, and that wasn't the only example of racism in the Encyclopedia Britannica, was an African-American sociologist and historian and activist called W.B. Du Bois. And in his Du Bois, who I should say was a very well-traveled intellectual, and shaped and influenced African and African descended communities in the Netherlands as well as in the UK. To counter that, the racism found in the Encyclopedia Britannica as well as in other places, Du Bois started a project called the Encyclopedia Africana. That wasn't the only encyclopedia project started by people of African ancestry. Carter G. Woodson started also an encyclopedia project in the 1920s. John Edward Bruce in the 1890s, actually. Daniel Murray, who was a librarian at what became the Library of, or what was the Library of Congress, also had a similar project going on. So immediately when I think of knowledge equity, I think of the generations of work that has been going on, that I'm just doing my tiny fragment on, to counter and to dispel the kind of dehumanization that has been that African people and African descended people have been viewed with. There's been a systematic dehumanization of African people. And then I also think about the limitations of knowledge equity as well, as a kind of understanding, or the limitation. Yeah, so I think Wikipedia defines it as a social movement where we will focus on the knowledge, we'll focus our efforts, that is the Wikimedia community's efforts, on the knowledge and communities that have been left out of structures of power and privilege, and therefore impacted who then can produce knowledge, or whose knowledge is seen as being valued. I always think about whether knowledge equity goes far enough into countering centuries worth of dehumanization, centuries worth of devaluing knowledge production of and by African and African descended people. So there's an African-American scholar called Gloria Ladson-Billings, who writes about the what's called in the States the achievement gap between African American and white American young people. And she found that the achievement gap, much like the knowledge gap that we sometimes talk about in Wikipedia, to think about it as a gap was inadequate. And she instead shaped her understanding around the kind of metaphor of a debt. And so I always think about, so as opposed to a knowledge gap, she thinks about a knowledge debt, because it reminds her that this is a gap that has been accumulated over time, that has been compounded over time, that has compromises of historic and economic and socio-political and moral components in that. It's not only a gap of knowledge production, but it's also a gap of all of the peoples that have been excluded from that over centuries, from that knowledge production over centuries. So when I think about so what are the measures that are necessary to address that knowledge debt, as I said, that has been compounded over centuries when it comes to knowledge about and by Africans and people of African ancestry. Thinking about it in the terms of justice rather than equity, I think goes a lot further to the kind of work that I think is necessary to move things forward. So those are kind of the two things that spring to mind. It's the fact that this work around knowledge justice has been going on for centuries. I mean, I just mentioned some encyclopedias over the past 150 years, but it was going on even before then. And I'm just, here doing my little corner, my little fragment of that work. But also, for me, the metaphor of knowledge debt rather than gap means so much, because it reminds me of this historic compounding over centuries, and also the framing of knowledge justice, I think, goes further towards what's necessary to address that debt.
I agree. Yeah, radical equity and knowledge justice is they're definitely terms that I'll be utilizing. Thank you very much for those. Yes, Jessica, I'm going to come over to you. At the Black Archive, in terms of knowledge production, how do you preserve or maybe create and share Black history, specifically at the Black Archive?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Like I said, it started I think I can talk from my own experience, but I think I can speak for a lot of children of color and Black children in the Netherlands, that we just didn't learn about our history. And when you don't learn about your history, you're also a bit, how you call it? You're looking for your own identity and a feeling of home, and basically, trying to make the world a special place for yourself. But if that's all been taken away from you, I think that is the thing that really brought me to the Black Archives and trying to build it. I think it comes back to the question, it doesn't start with the children books, it's the schools and the curriculum. It goes back to historians, what do they write? And historians go to their source, and those are archives. So what is then worthy to collect, to preserve, to write about, to share within the world? If you go back to the archives, there are just huge gaps. And that is something that we're trying to fill in. And it's at the Black Archives, it was actually very much, or how you say that in English, organically, in a natural way. So to go back to where we started it. Sorry, somebody. It started with we as students understanding that there was huge gaps in the curriculum, and then trying to find our own identity. And as a student organization, we had this network with different Black students. And one of these students, their father was a historian, not a historian, from a historical perspective, doing psychology around the issue of slavery and colonialism in a Dutch context. Unfortunately, he passed away, but he left hundreds of books. So the first collection at the Black Archives was part of his books, which actually became very visible to us as not only as us as a Black community, but actually, for other people outside of our communities to understand, like, there is a lot written about history and slavery, colonialism, Afro-Caribbean people of African descent. And it's not that scarce as the system actually makes it seems. So that is how we actually started it. It really started from a very organic way of understanding what we think is important to us. What do we think is worthy? What would we think is inspiring? And after now, I can say after 5, 6, 7 years since we founded it, yeah, I like that more communities are understanding, like, whoa, there's a lot of history that is indeed inspiring and we can learn about. So the Black Archives has been playing a key role in making accessible Black history, especially from a Black Dutch context, and understanding that the conversation about institutional racism are not new, but there has been for decades, if not for centuries, also on this continent, Europe. It's not just on the African continent or in the Caribbean, no, on this continent that always have seen as white, there has been a lot of conversation about racism.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Hakim, in terms of archives that you use, could you tell us about some archives that you utilize and how they preserve Black histories and play a role in producing and sharing knowledge?
Well, I use a lot of different archives when I'm writing, some physical archives, some online archives, and they're all very different because they have different objectives, we could say. I mean, here in Britain, we have the Black Cultural Archives based in Brixton in London, which is an important community archive, we could call it. It came out of community initiatives and is extremely important, and has always undergone a struggle to consolidate itself, develop itself, but it contains very important material, like the Black Archives in the Netherlands. It's deciding or considering what kind of knowledge it needs to, what kind of material it needs to retain and to present to the public. But it's an important archive that I've used. It needs more development in many ways, but it's important in that it has as its aim to preserve this important historical material. There are other archives in Britain, like the National Archives, which are rather different, because the National Archives is essentially an archive of government records, government documents. And so it contains different types of material, and it has what you could call a different acquisitions policy, if I can put it in that way, which includes destroying material, hiding material, refusing to allow people to see material, and so on, and is controlled essentially by the government and its various departments. And so it's rather problematic. It's also a place where it's quite difficult to find material. And even the archivists don't know where it is half of the time. So those are two, you could say, archives that are almost diametrically opposed in their outlook and in some ways in their accessibility as well. But then these days, obviously, there are lots of archives online that contain important material that's been digitized. It could be newspapers or other records and so on. And for the kind of history that I write, I have to use not only archival material that may be based in Britain, archival material in the US, in the Caribbean, in the Netherlands, in France, in Russia, in Africa, and wherever. So and even for historical research on organizations that are British based, it's very often you have to draw on material that comes from archival sources that are not in Britain. So, and again, some of those archives struggle with financial challenges. I'm thinking of particularly archives in Africa, sometimes archives in the Caribbean. Again, some other archives are government controlled, it could be quite difficult to access. I'm thinking of like government's archives in Russia, for example. So they all have their own they all have their own specific qualities and attributes. And I suppose part of the job of the historian is to be able to kind of navigate all those archives and to then to present the material in a form that people can consume. So you could say that, you know, the books I produce or other things I write are in themselves archives of some sort, that they're maybe a more popular form of archive that people can go and find information that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have access to if I'm writing a book for children or whatever, for adults and so on. So there are lots of different repositories of knowledge. And then the other important archive or repository are ourselves, the human repository, the human archives. And it's very important. One of the things which the Young Historians Project does a lot of is to interview elders, not necessarily only elders, but particularly elders who have a rich life experience. And it's very important that we record those life histories and utilize them, make them more well known. And it's certainly something Black Cultural Archives has done and other archives of that kind. But that is very important work that everybody can do. It doesn't have to be an archive. We, as individuals, can record our parents, our grandparents, our family members who've got particular experiences and preserve that material for posterity.
Indeed. Thank you very much. Over to Kelly. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Jessica.
I may add to Minister Hakim. We know each other. Hey, how are you?
Very well.
I just gave you.
I'm just ignoring you, just for appearance's sake.
I just gave Hakim's last copy of my archive to somebody who went to Suriname. He really wanted that book, so thank you so much.
I'll have to replace it somehow.
Yeah, there is no rush. What I wanted to say to actually on Hakim Adi is that you know, we are the Black archives, but we are not professional archivists. Like, we really do this without even knowing anything about archiving. And I think that is something that I think all of us want to share. Like, you don't need like this high education or particular stuff, just do it. Like, indeed, go do oral history with elders, like Body says archive. There's so much knowledge now that's so necessary to, how you said it in English, to write down. It's so important. So we are not professional archivists either. We just want to learn more about ourselves, and that is just how we do it. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. I'd now like to talk about the free knowledge movement. This will be a question for everyone, but I'll start with Kelly, because Kelly specifically schooled me on the difficulties around essentially paywalled archives and the lack of easy, open access to the archives that we needed when we collaborated. So I'd love it if you could start, Kelly, with maybe talking a little bit about those limitations, but more importantly, talking about strategies around those limitations and how, you know, how others, how you know, how everyone could work to advance knowledge in the free movement.
That's a big question. So
it is. That's why it's to everyone. We'll start with you. No problem.
Let me see if I can begin a bit with that. I think Wikipedia came out of the came out of the people who were working on the internet at a kind of time of utopian vision when we being the users of the internet, the creators of the internet, as in the people who were creating content, we thought everything could be accessed for free or created for free. Over the past 20 years, it's become more and more, when I say it's, access to knowledge, access to information has become more and more restricted through monetization, whether things are still within copyright or whether they're unrestricted by copyright and in the public domain. It's been more and more restricted by money and whether you can pay to get access to things behind a paywall. I think particularly when it comes to thinking about writing and accessing histories of Africa and the African diaspora, this is particularly harmful. And this is why it's so inspiring. Projects like Black Cultural Archives, the Black Archives in the Netherlands, even, the archives that are being created by the Young Historian Project are so incredible, is because there is also a commitment to open and free access to that information as well for anybody. And that's a kind of vital part of it. For me, there is a body of work, a growing body of work, which Hakim is one of the people working on that in academia, and also with the historians that he trains at Chichester and in other places. There is a growing body of work and knowledge within academia being produced by professionally trained historians about the histories of people of African and Caribbean origin in the UK, but oftentimes that doesn't necessarily filter down into being kind of popular knowledge or general knowledge that's well known. And for me, Wikipedia is a really vital part of that process in making information better well known, because it's free to access and because it often provides or gives signposts to people who want to know more. I'm always astounded, like in a family WhatsApp group or on TikTok, when I see Wikipedia being screenshotted as a kind of evidence of a certain level of authority. It always reminds me of how vital it is nowadays to have things represented on Wikipedia. If it isn't there, then I think there's an assumption for a lot of people that it doesn't exist. So part of the work that I do with Wikipedia is to use access to what is often paywalled knowledge, paywalled academic articles and journals. I dig through digitized archives and of libraries and archives in the States or in Europe or in the UK to see if I can provide illustrations, images on Wikipedia of digitized images that are out of copyright, or even archival citations or citations from archival records as well, where it would help to enhance the quality of an article. But all of that takes time. It takes my own time and resources and my own rudimentary levels of knowledge and skill in doing that. And that's part of the reason why I'm particularly so passionate about addressing what is a kind of a further inequity, and that is the amount of people of African heritage that are actually editing Wikipedia and are actually motivated both to look for this information, but also to know about ways in which to reframe the kind of very Eurocentric worldview that very oftentimes Wikipedia articles are written in. And then just finally on that, which I think is a bit of our devotion, but I just want to reflect a little bit of what Jessica said about professional archives or professional archivists. Since we are talking sort of broadly in the realms of knowledge production as a kind of colonial project as well. the archives profession and even the establishment of archives, the idea of archives, is also a result of the kind of colonial worldview. European global empires were empires of where it wasn't only cash or commodities or slave produced commodities that were one of the commodities or valuable assets that European empires wanted to control, but knowledge was also one of those valuable assets that European empires wanted to control. So archives as a profession is based on archival science as a profession, as a training, is based on systems, worldviews, ways of knowing that were established as part of the colonial project. So now there are part of the reason why the Black Archives in the Netherlands and Black Cultural Archives in London are so exciting is because they are part of the process of rethinking how archives are structured, how archives are described, how we give access to archives, how archives are created to be part of the tool towards and for anti-colonialism, and to actually question some of the assumptions of that there's been going on for the past 150 years of how archives should be created and cared for and given access to. So the making of archives is also a really important part of this kind of cycle of knowledge production. I would say that the writing of history or the making of history is also part of that. Encyclopedism, based on the reliable sources that historians like Hakim create, are also part of that cycle. So it's important that when we think about Black history or think about the history of people of Africa and the Caribbean, we think about it as being in this cycle of knowledge production. It's not just making history, it's not just making archives, it's not just encyclopedism, it's all of those aspects of knowledge production are necessary for us to think about.
Amazing. We're moving into the last kind of 7-8 minutes, so I'm going to hop to the last question. I'm not sure how many people are in attendance, but thanks to everyone for attending. The last question is quite pointed and quite specific. So I'd like to know from our esteemed panelists, what specific actions could everyone that's in attendance take to help focus and propel knowledge equity, knowledge justice, radical equity? If you could give me maybe 1 or 2 specific actions they could take, or some support that you'd like to see take place, or any way that they could get involved. I'm putting you all on the spot, excuse me. So yeah, maybe 1 or 2 actions from each, and we'll start with Jessica, please.
Oh, wow. The only thing that I actually can think of, and I think I've mentioned before, is to keep making, yes, if Black history is becoming more accessible and more people get to know about Black history and Black people's heritage, make sure that Black people are still the owner of that knowledge. So keep referencing Black people. That's something that is very short maybe, but to give an example, like a couple of weeks ago, there was, I will not delve too much into it, but to give an example, there was a political issue in my neighborhood, which is the Black neighborhood of Amsterdam. And this book was thrown out a lot, but it was produced by a white man. But there was also a Black man who wrote a lot about it. He was quoted by the white man, but the white person's name was only put into the, I call it, the media.
Yeah, the coverage.
The coverage was only about this white person's name. So we have to keep reference where that knowledge came from. It goes back to, people of color, Black people in this case. So keep referencing people like Kelly, like Yutas, Hakim, keep referencing where it comes from.
Indeed, thank you very much. Professor Adi, over to you. What maybe 1 or 2 specific actions could everyone in attendance take to advance knowledge equity and knowledge justice?
I mean, that's a difficult one. I think being more critical of received wisdom, I would say, would be something which everybody could do and should do, and also being more confident about our own experience and expressing our own experience, if you like, or because you know, one of the problems with this whole question of, if we just look at history and in Britain, that the history of people of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain is British history. I mean, it's also other history. It's also African history and Caribbean history and world history, but it's British history. So the elimination of people of African and Caribbean descent from the history of Britain is a distortion, is a falsification of the history of Britain, and it has kind of profound consequences, not just for people of African and Caribbean heritage, but for everybody in Britain. And just very, very quickly to give an example, we have a very famous African of the 18th century called Olaudah Equiano, who was an abolitionist, to cut the story short. Now, eliminating him and people like him is bad enough, you could say. But in fact, in the rendering of Britain's history, almost the entire abolitionist movement is eliminated, is obliterated. And that movement was one of the biggest, probably the biggest political movement ever in Britain's history. So when you falsify history, you falsify the history of the whole country, and you essentially remove the agency of people. That mass movement involved women, it involved workers, it involved Africans, it involved everybody in Britain. And so removing it, you then distort people's whole understanding of Britain's past and therefore their own agency in history. And we study history not just to make ourselves feel good. It may make us feel good, it may not. But we study history, we're concerned with history because it gives us an understanding of the world in which we live, of our own agency, our own ability to actually change that world in which we live and to bring things under our control and put ourselves at the center of things, to empower ourselves. So we want to have that outlook, that understanding of the world. We can't allow others to take it away from us. So I think to be critical of received wisdom would be the key thing, I would say.
Amazing. Thank you ever so much. And over to Kelly.
Yeah, I don't know if you should have allowed me to have the last word, but first of all, to echo what Hakim has said, and I think one of the things you asked was what actions can individuals take? And I think one of the greatest actions individuals can take is to organize. Whether that might be in your family unit, in your community, with a readers group in your library, whatever that means that is significant to you, to organize for the change that you want to see. And as Hakim has mentioned, and I will fully support that, kind of one of the biggest lessons for me, especially when it comes to how we think of Black history, is that oftentimes it's focused on individuals rather than the agency and the actions of networks and organizations and communities, which there is so much richness when thinking, particularly in the UK, when thinking about the histories of African and Caribbean people in the UK, and the organizing that was done in those communities to bring about change, but also the organizing that those peoples had with people outside of these islands, the international connections that they were, is hugely inspiring for me. So I would say that the biggest thing that people can do is to organise on whatever level that makes sense for them. And then for any Wikipedians that may be watching or listening, and this kind of again fully supports what Jessica mentioned, and that is thinking about the politics of citation when we're contributing to Wikipedia. Who are we citing? Whose references are we using? What worldviews are we then emphasizing or further entrenching into the online encyclopedia when we have a very narrow perspective on what counts as a valuable source? You know, as Wikipedians, we also have to be critical about where we're finding those reliable sources and how we're writing and contributing to the encyclopedia as well. So yeah, those are my two things.
Amazing. And with that, we've reached the end of our panel. I'd like to say thank you ever so much to our panelists. Kelly, thank you. Jessica, thank you. Hakim, thank you. Thanks to everyone in attendance, and enjoy the rest of your Black History Month. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.